Carl Puati, 61 years old, 39 years on death row. The victim, Sherilyn Ritchie, was killed by Carl Puati and Robert Dewey Glock, who then robbed and killed her. On August 16, 1983, Ritchie was approached by Puati and Glock when she got out of her car in a Bradenton shopping center parking lot. After forcing Ritchie back into her vehicle, the two took off in it. They grabbed $50 from her purse and forced her to use her bank to cash a $100 check. As they were leaving Dade City, they took Ritchie to an orange grove where they stole the victim's wedding ring and left her by the side of the road. The two drove a short way before deciding to kill the woman, at which point they drove back to her. She was twice shot by Puati. When they saw she was still standing after they had driven off, they turned around and shot her again. The two took a third pass with the automobile, and when the woman didn't collapse, Glock shot her once more. 4 days later, a New Jersey state trooper pulled over the victim's car and discovered 2 firearms inside. On the basis of a weapons violation, he detained Puati and Glock. The murder weapon was eventually determined by police to be the revolver in the glove box of the vehicle. The following day, Puati and Glock each admitted to robbing and killing the victim. Although the early admissions were inconsistent, on August 24, 1983, both men delivered a joint statement in which they concurred that Glock had first suggested shooting the victim, that Puati had fired the opening shots, and that Glock had fired the last shots. Jeffrey Muhlman, 59 years old, 39 years on death row. On May 2, 1983, 97-year-old Bowman hired Muhlman as a helper. Muhlman impersonated Jeff Williams. On May 4, 1983, Muhlman had decided to rob and kill the victim by the afternoon. He requested assistance from a friend with the heist and body disposal. When this acquaintance failed to show up on the evening of May 4, 1983, Muhlman made the decision to carry out the crime himself. He placed 2 nearly empty coffee cups on the kitchen table and covered it with breadcrumbs. These acts were an attempt to give the impression that the two had breakfast and then gotten into the victim's car to go for a drive. After that, Muhlman cleaned the house to get rid of his fingerprints. He repeatedly struck the victim, who was sleeping in his bed, with a cast-iron frying pan. Muhlman tried to strangle the victim after these blows failed to kill him, but he was unable to stop the blood supply to the brain. The victim was awake long enough to plead for mercy as he lay in his bed helpless and staring at Muhlman. Following that, Muhlman pushed 2 newspapers into the victim's throat while removing their plastic wrappers. As the bags showed the victim was still breathing, Muhlman pushed them further down the throat. In the end, the victim died. Gregory Coal, 60 years old, 39 years on death row. On September 29, 1983, at midnight, Gregory Allen Coal and William O'Kelly picked up victim Jeffrey Russell, who was a hitchhiker. Then they took a car to a park in Jacksonville Beach. Russell was attacked as soon as they got out of the car and battered with Coal's pool cue before being robbed. Russell was ordered to go about 100 feet, where he begged for his life while being knocked out by the pool cue. It was discovered during the autopsy that the victim was murdered by a gunshot. Only the investigating cops knew that a gunshot was the cause of death. Police caught Coal the following morning when he took off in O'Kelly's pickup from a fueling station without paying. Coal offered O'Kelly's Colorado license, the victim's New York license, an Arizona vehicle registration in O'Kelly's name, along with his own Florida license when the police officer asked for identification. In connection with the gasoline theft, the police detained Coal and inventoried the truck. The murder weapon and the box of shells bearing Coal's prints were discovered during the truck's search. However, Coal was let go since the officer was unaware of his role in the killing. Coal told a friend about the heist and murder later that day, including information that was only available to the police, such as the fatal gunshot. After a warrant was issued for Coal's arrest, he was taken into custody. Joe Nixon, 62 years old, 38 years on death row. Nixon was found guilty of murdering and kidnapping a woman from a parking lot at a Tallahassee, Florida shopping center. On August 12, 1984, in the parking lot of the Governor's Square Mall in Tallahassee, Florida, Nixon approached Gene Bickner. Bickner was asked to assist Nixon in jump-starting his vehicle. He later accepted Bickner's offer to drive him home. Nixon gave the woman the indication to travel to a remote location after they were on the road in Bickner's 1973 MG sports car. Bickner was eventually subdued by Nixon, who then stopped the vehicle. He put Bickner in the car's trunk and headed to the woods in southern Leon County, Florida. Bickner was freed from the trunk by Nixon, who then used jumper wires to tie her to a tree and set her on fire, ultimately killing her. The next day, on August 13, 1984, a pair of joggers moving through the wooded region discovered Bickner's burned remains. Around this time, Nixon learned that Bickner's body had been discovered, and panicking, he set fire to both the MG and Bickner's personal effects. Nixon's family members eventually phoned the police when he admitted to them that he had killed someone. Shortly after, Nixon was detained and accused of kidnapping and killing Bickner. Nixon was sentenced to death in Florida's electric chair on July 30, 1985, after being found guilty of murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and arson. He is currently incarcerated on death row and waiting for the Union Correctional Institution to carry out his execution. Richard Rhodes, 70 years old, 38 years on death row. The body of Karen Nieradka was discovered amid debris that had been brought to St. Petersburg from the Sunset Hotel's Clearwater demolition site on March 24, 1984. The demolition took place on the 15th of March. It was discovered that Nieradka had been manually strangled to death. Richard Rhodes had been pulled over by the Florida Highway Patrol on March 2, 1984, and was later detained for operating a vehicle without a license. Rhodes was stopped while using a vehicle under Nieradka's registration. He was questioned by the police on March 26, 1984, and he provided various accounts, but he insisted on denying any participation in the killing. On April 27, 1984, Rhodes attempted to cut a deal with the police, stating that he would reveal Nieradka's cause of death in exchange for being sent to a mental hospital. According to Rhodes, the victim's death was the result of an unintentional fall from the Sunset Hotel's third floor. However, 3 Pinellas County Jail inmates testified throughout the trial that Rhodes had admitted to killing Nieradka. Matthew Marshall, 59 years old, 34 years on death row. Marshall was found guilty of first-degree murder and given the death penalty on December 12, 1989. On November 1, 1988, Marshall and Jeffrey Henry were both detained at the Martin Correctional Institution. Marshall was incarcerated at the time for prior criminal offenses. Witnesses reported hearing screaming and wailing coming from Henry's cell on the day of the murder. Blood was spotted on Marshall's arms and chest when he left his cell. Witnesses heard similar noises coming from Henry's cell again moments later when they watched Marshall enter Henry's cell once more. Marshall was observed leaving Henry's cell after a little period of silence, this time covered in blood. In his cell, laying face down with his hands tied behind his back and his sweatpants pulled down to his ankles, Henry was discovered dead. Heavy blows to the back of the skull were the cause of Henry's demise. Marshall claimed that Henry was referred to as the muscle man by prisoners who ran football game pools. Marshall won a lot of money and tried to get the other prisoners to pay him his gains. The inmates instructed Marshall to get his winnings from Henry. Marshall and Henry got into an altercation once Henry refused to pay when they met at Marshall's cell. Henry attacked first, and Marshall claimed that he killed Henry in self-defense. Harold Harvey, 61 years old, 37 years on death row. Harold Lee Harvey and Harry Scott Stittler met up on February 23, 1985, with the intent to rob William and Ruby Boyd. They were armed with an AR-15 assault weapon and a pistol. Harvey and Stittler received money from the Boyds, but they then made the decision to murder them. The Boyds fled when they learned about the plan, but Harvey shot them with an AR-15. Harvey and Stittler walked away from the site, but Harvey subsequently came back to get the bullet casings. When he returned, Mrs. Boyd was whining in pain, and he shot her in the head at close range. In Okeechobee County, Florida, on February 27, 1985, Harvey was pulled over for a traffic offense and later arrested for the Boyd killings. When he was questioned following the reading of his Miranda rights, he confessed to being involved in the killings. On May 11, 1986, Harvey broke out of the Okeechobee County Jail. The following day, a North Miami Beach police officer discovered Harvey sleeping in a vehicle. Harvey pointed a revolver at the police after he awoke him, and the officer then shot Harvey. Harvey tried to flee in the policeman's patrol car but was apprehended and restrained. Harry Scott Stitler agreed to a plea deal, admitted to first-degree murder, and received a life sentence. Kenneth Stewart, 60 years old, 37 years on death row. In 1984, Ruben Diaz's body was discovered in the morning. Diaz had received 2 headshots, one in front of the head and the other behind the right ear, at a distance of no more than 1 foot. Around 12:15 a.m., a resident of a nearby neighborhood reported hearing gunshots to police. Later that day, in the parking lot of a mall, police officers came across Diaz's burning car. A few months later, police detained Stewart in connection with related crimes, and while he was in custody, they accused him of first-degree murder and second-degree arson for the crimes committed on June 6, 1984. Randall Bilbray and Terry Smith were 2 crucial witnesses for the prosecution at Stewart's trial. Bilbray testified that Stewart admitted to robbing a man who matched Diaz's description. Bilbray lived in the same trailer as Stewart for around 10 days. In his testimony, Stewart and his accomplice allegedly planned to rob the driver of a large, expensive-looking car that was parked outside the bar the night of the murder. Diaz was inside the pub when the 2 men approached him and talked with him before persuading him to give them a ride. Stewart, who was riding in the rear seat, requested that Diaz drive to a forested area after pulling out a revolver. At the location, Stewart gave Diaz the go-ahead to exit the vehicle, lie on the ground, and cover his head with his hands. Stewart stole a tiny cocaine vial and $50 from Diaz's wallet. The second man was inciting Stewart to shoot Diaz twice in the head, and he actually did it. After leaving Diaz's body at the scene, the 2 men went to a nearby mall, parked the car, and lit it on fire to prevent fingerprints from being left behind. Grover Reed, 62 years old, 36 years on death row. Grover Reed arrived in Jacksonville in December 1985 with a female girlfriend, 2 kids, and no money or lodging. They were housed in the residence of a preacher, Reverend Orman, and his wife Betty, through a group called Traveler's Aid. When he discovered the drug paraphernalia, Reverend Orman requested them to leave the house, but he continued to provide Reed with financial support and transportation for a while. The Ormans eventually stopped supporting Reed financially because they thought they were being taken advantage of. In response to the interruption of support, Reed threatened to get even. Betty Orman was essayed, strangled, and stabbed on February 27, 1986. That evening, after he got home from class, the Reverend discovered her in the living room. A baseball cap was found by the cops. Police broadcast a recreation of the crime at the scene and showed the headgear as evidence. The hat was recognized by one viewer as being comparable to the one Reed was wearing on the day Betty Orman was murdered. Additionally, Grover Reed's fingerprints and hair samples collected at the site could be linked to him by the police. According to testimony from an expert, Reed's DNA was recovered. Additionally, checks that were taken from the house and dumped in the yard had Reed's fingerprints on them as well. Reed's cellmate, Nigel Hacksaw, testified that he acknowledged to entering the house illegally and killing Betty Orman. Mark Davis, 60 years old, 36 years on death row. When Orville Landis moved into an apartment on July 1, 1985, Mark Davis had just arrived in St. Petersburg, Florida, and was residing in the Gandy Efficiency Apartments parking lot. Landis accepted Davis's offer to assist with the relocation, and once they had settled in, Davis and Landis started to share beers. Landis loaned money to Davis, and according to witnesses, Landis had about $500 in cash on hand that day. Separately, Davis revealed to 2 residents of the apartment building that he intended to rob Landis and do him in. Later, Landis and Davis were observed fighting over money before entering Landis's residence. Around 8:30 p.m., Landis was last observed alive. Around midnight, Davis was last seen driving off in Landis's vehicle. Landis' window was opened by a worried neighbor, and she saw him laying on his bed in a pool of blood. The only thing in his wallet was a $1 bill. He was repeatedly stabbed in the back, chest, and neck. He was struck multiple times in the face, choked or struck hard enough to break the hyoid bone in the throat. He was so intoxicated that he was unable to defend himself, and he was still alive and conscious at the time each wound was administered. Evidence established that the chest and back wounds were caused by a large butcher knife discovered at the scene, while the throat wounds were caused by a small blade knife that was broken during the attack. Paul Brown, 73 years old, 36 years on death row. On March 19, 1986, in the early hours of the morning, Barry and Gail Barlow were awakened by the sound of 2 gunshots. They discovered Pauline Cowell, Gail's sister, who was just 17 years old, dead in their house's Florida room after looking into the shot's origin. Cowell's friend Tammy Bird had also been shot, but she lived. The door was found to be open, and the padlock that had kept the chamber secure from the outside was missing. Brown was identified by the authorities as a potential suspect, and the search was launched for him. Sheriff's deputies discovered Brown hiding behind a shed in the trailer park where his brother resided. A handgun that matched the one used in the shootings of Cowell and Bird was discovered in Brown's jeans. At the time of the murder, Brown was residing with Cowell's mother, and Cowell had only recently relocated from her mother's to her sister's house. Brown said under questioning that he broke into the Barlow home to confront Cowell about some lies she was spreading. He claimed that his objective was to shoot Cowell only if she started to scream. He did not intend to kill her. Michael Rivera, 61 years old, 36 years on death row. Stacy Lynn Jasvac rode her bicycle to the store on January 30, 1986 to get school supplies. Her mother started looking for her when she didn't come home. A Broward County deputy sheriff who had located Jasvac's bicycle was confronted by the mother. At that point, a police inquiry started. Upon receiving a call from a man claiming to be Stacy Lynn Jasvac's killer, Star Peck reported the incident to the police. Peck stated that a man who identified himself as Tony contacted and talked to her about his thoughts regarding sex while dressed as a woman. Peck had more than 30 of these calls from Tony. Peck's final call came not long after Jasvac was killed. Tony told Peck that he intended to expose himself to Jasvac since he had seen her get off a bike. Tony claimed to have forced Stacy into the van, put ether over her mouth, and then essayed her inside. He also said that he had no intention of killing the 11-year-old girl, but it still happened. Similar calls from a man named Tony were reported by other local women as well. According to the authorities, Tony was actually Michael Rivera, an employee of Peck. Police discovered Stacy Lynn Jasvac's body on February 14, 1986, in a Coral Springs field. She suffocated to death, according to the medical examiner. Melvin Trotter, 63 years old, 36 years on death row. Trotter disemboweled Virgie Langford, the owner of a grocery shop, on June 16, 1986, after stabbing her 6 times in the right side and once in the left. On that day, Trotter was seen rushing away from the Langford's store, according to Eleanora Oates' testimony. Trotter inquired about the availability of crack cocaine from Oates. Oates accompanied Trotter as he purchased the drugs and afterwards went with him to his mother's house. The day was spent watching television and using substances. That afternoon, Trotter had tied money and food stamps in a red bandana, and Oates assisted him in counting them. Trotter explained to Oates that he was given the cash and food stamps in exchange for working. After the assault, Langford was discovered by a truck driver still alive. When questioned, Langford was able to provide details about the attacker, describing him as a short black male with a Tropicana Steph ID. After being taken to the hospital and having a surgery, the victim later passed away from a cardiac arrest as a result of the injuries. Both the victims' and witnesses' descriptions of Trotter were accurate. Police specifically asked about a Tropicana employee called Melvin after seeing the employee identification tag. Trotter's handprint was also discovered on the meat refrigerator. Later, the authorities discovered a t-shirt at Trotter's house with a bloodstain that matched the blood type of the victim. James Daly, 77 years old, 36 years on death row. In the gruesome 1985 Florida killing of 14-year-old Shelley Boggio, Daly was found guilty. She had 31 stab wounds when she was discovered naked in a canal. Most of the injuries were to her hands, which the authorities believe were caused by her attempt to defend herself. She was probably still alive when she was pulled into the river and left to die, according to a medical examiner. According to his lawyers, there is no physical or forensic evidence linking Daly to the homicide. Daly's roommate, Jack Piercy, was a person of interest in the investigation at the time of the murder. He admitted that he at least once stabbed the girl, but Daly was the one who murdered her. Piercy signed a declaration saying he acted alone in the death of Boggio, but later recanted. The document stated, "James Daly had nothing to do with the murder of Shelley Boggio. I committed the crime alone. James Daly was back at the house when I drove Shelley Boggio to the place where I ultimately killed her." William Reeves, 75 years old, 31 years on death row. On September 23, 1986, Deputy Sheriff Richard Rokowski responded to a 911 call made from a Zippy Mart convenience store payphone close to Vero Beach. Reeves claimed that the reason he made the call was because he lacked the funds to call a cab. To hire a taxi and find out if William Reeves had any outstanding warrants, the deputy also dialed 911. Reeves said that while he and the deputy were waiting for the cab, a revolver accidentally dropped out of his pants. The deputy stepped on Reeves' hands as he attempted to grab the gun. After a struggle, Reeves managed to get the gun away from the deputy by holding him by the throat. Deputy Sheriff stepped away from Reeves, asking him not to kill him, and then he turned and ran. The deputy was shot 4 times in the back by Reeves as he was running. The witness who located the deputy claimed to have seen a black male sprinting away while wearing red shorts and a white t-shirt. Later in the morning, the deputy passed away. Dominic Oone, 78 years old, 36 years on death row. On June 10, 1986, early in the morning, Oone woke up his ex-girlfriend Anita Gerety by banging on the slide glass door to her bedroom. She lived there with her parents, Raymond and Martha Artzner, and her kids. After Gerety declined to speak with him, Oone walked away but later came back with a weapon. After cutting the outside telephone wires, Oone awoke the family. Gerety Artzner's father confronted him outdoors and Oone shot him. While Gerety and her daughter were trying to escape the house, he entered the home and then shot Martha Artzner, Gerety's mother, 4 times. Dennis Sokor, 71 years old, 36 years on death row. Dennis Sokor was found guilty of murdering Patricia Gifford and given the death penalty. His brother, Gary Sokor, testified that on New Year's Eve of 1981, he and Dennis met Patricia Gifford, the victim, at a bar. Gary reported that while he waited in the pickup outside the lounge, Dennis and Gifford were kissing. Gifford consented to go to breakfast with Gary and Dennis. Gary stated that Dennis had driven to a remote location in the truck while the victim was seated between the brothers. Dennis then brought the car to a stop. Gary asserted that Dennis assaulted Gifford while she yelled for help and that he attempted to intervene to halt the assault but was directed to return to the truck. After some time, Dennis returned to the truck as well and they drove home. Gary discovered a woman's shoe, sweatshirt, and set of keys in Dennis's truck the following morning. The keys were concealed by him. Gary noticed later that the shoe and sweater had been taken off and that the truck had been cleaned. Dennis requested the keys, so Gary gave them to him. A few days later, Gary went back to Michigan. At the trial, a female friend of the victim who had gone to the lounge with Gifford gave testimony. She claimed that they celebrated New Year's Eve in the lounge. The friend fell ill in the middle of the night, and Gifford helped her to her car with the Sokor brothers' assistance. The following morning, Gifford's companion got out of bed, noticed that Gifford was gone, and dialed 911. A picture of Gifford and an unidentified male from that night was found by the police. The image was shown on television, and according to testimony from Dennis Sokor's roommates, when he saw the image of himself at the pub with the victim, Sokor swiftly departed. Gary Sokor was questioned by the police when they learned that he had recently moved back to Michigan. Gary claimed to the police that Gifford's disappearance was the fault of Dennis Sokor. He also consented to go back to Florida and assist in locating the body. However, the body of the victim was never discovered by the police. After being detained in Georgia on unrelated charges, Dennis Sokor was sent also back to Florida. John Freeman, 60 years old, 35 years on death row. On November 11, 1986, Leonard Collier discovered John Freeman breaking into his house. A neighbor overheard the two fighting over the rifle and also heard a gunshot. The neighbor saw Collier attempt to crawl away from the attack while Freeman took hold of the rifle and struck him repeatedly. Collier was hit 10 to 12 times in the head, but didn't have any bullet wounds. He eventually passed away as a result of his injuries. Later, Freeman was discovered hiding beneath a wharf and arrested by authorities. Richard Anderson, 75 years old, 35 years on death row. Anderson was found guilty and given the death penalty for the murder of Robert Grantham on May 7, 1987. Connie Beasley, Anderson's girlfriend, apparently received from Robert Grantham an offer for a large quantity of money in exchange for a night together. Beasley informed Anderson of Grantham's offer after rejecting it. Anderson assumed Grantham was wealthy and was aware that he would be bringing his earnings back from a gaming trip to Las Vegas. Beasley was told by Anderson to agree to spend one night with Grantham in exchange for $10,000. She was also instructed to get Grantham drunk so that Anderson could rob him later. After dinner and a few beers, Beasley took Grantham to Anderson's apartment. Later that evening, Anderson showed up at the flat under the pretext that he needed a ride home after returning Beasley's car. Anderson requested that Beasley ride with them, and Grantham consented to drive him. From the back seat of the car, Anderson fatally shot Grantham 4 times in the head. He then dumped the body in a forested location. When Grantham was shot, Connie Beasley was seated on the front passenger's side. At the Tampa International Airport, Anderson abandoned Grantham's vehicle and took Beasley back to his apartment. Anderson and Beasley searched Grantham's possessions but only came up with $2,600. Jerry Halliburton, 69 years old, 35 years on death row. On August 9, 1981, while on parole, Jerry Halliburton broke into Donald Bohannon's home and stabbed him 31 times in the neck, chest, arms, and private parts. Bohannon died as a result. Halliburton was detained by the police after the crime was committed, and when a lawyer was hired, he was not permitted to speak with Halliburton. Halliburton underwent a polygraph test while being questioned. The interrogation was halted until a court order was secured, allowing the lawyer to speak with Halliburton. The defendant allegedly admitted to killing Bohannon because he just wanted to test his ability to kill another person. Paul Johnson, 74 years old, 35 years on death row. In a night-long spree that started just after midnight on January 9, 1981, when a dispatcher overheard a stranger's voice over a taxicab's radio stating that cab driver William Evans had been knocked unconscious, Johnson was found guilty of killing 3 people. Evans had been shot twice in the head, his wallet and fare money were missing, and his cab had been set on fire when his body was discovered in a grove 5 days later. Johnson requested a ride from Ray Beasley and his friend Amy Reed at 3 a.m. on January 9 so he could use the restroom. Johnson wanted them to stop along a lonely section of Drainfield Road. Johnson was convicted of shooting Beasley on the side of the road, and when Reed fled in the car to call for help, Johnson fatally shot Deputy Theron A. Burnham 3 times with his own service revolver after he responded to Reed's call. Johnson was arrested the following day after telling friends he had shot a deputy. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.